Emotional affairs can actually be just as damaging as physical ones, leaving betrayed partners feeling isolated, confused, and just immensely hurt. In this video, I'm sitting with infidelity expert therapist Laurie Bryson and our founder, Rick Reynolds, talking all about why emotional affairs can be so damaging. We'll explore what actually qualifies as an emotional affair, how each spouse might need to shift their perspective of what happened, why emotional affairs can sometimes be even more confusing to recover from, and ultimately how you can move forward and get your life back. Here's my conversation with Rick and Laurie. The first question regarding emotional affairs is, how do you define one? What are the signs that somebody might be in one, especially if they're unsure?
An emotional affair is really, I like to think of it as what we do with our mind and our heart, not necessarily our body. One of the biggest myths out there is that an affair means I had sex with someone or there was physical contact, and that's not the case. An emotional affair becomes, this moment in time when someone in a committed relationship goes outside of that relationship, and what often begins as a friendship, quite platonic, crosses these lines emotionally into this entanglement of romanticism and longing. And we can talk about a lot of what those emotional connections are. So it's really your mind and your heart that's entangled with this person, and not necessarily physically with your body.
With an emotional affair, knowing that nothing physical happened, but there's this kind of heart and mind component that's already going on, why is that so difficult for people to navigate, deal with, understand?
Because people lie to themselves. They totally deceive themselves. So there's a concept in Catholicism, mortal versus venial sin. In the Jewish tradition, we have sin, transgressions, iniquities. There's kind of these levels. And so people will tell themselves that if we're not being sexual, that's a quote venial sin. That's not nearly as bad as if we were actually having sex. So then they give themselves permission, I think, to hold on to something they know that's inappropriate. But since they're not doing this, it's okay. Now, if they were to do this, then somehow it would now be an affair. But as long as it's just emotional, it's not an affair. And that is bovine fecal matter. The fact is, it is an affair, and the damage done to the betrayed spouse is absolutely the same, whether or not you're being sexual or you're not being sexual.
This goes back to it being a matter of the heart. And I can imagine somebody growing up in a more traditional spiritual environment like that. It's very transactional. And so, you can go fill up your sin bucket, and then you can go confess it on the weekends, and then you can go back out and fill it. And so the phrase, as long as it's not just fill in the blank, is most of the time usually a justification for something that is potentially sinful. But in the same spirituality, when you read the teachings of Jesus, it's so much more a matter of the heart. And that's where emotional affairs go. And I say that knowing we all come from different faith backgrounds and all of that, but it is a great example of kind of where the dichotomy is between the act itself and the intent of the heart. One of the big things I think people ask, and it's interesting to sit across from both of you who for decades have treated people with physical and emotional affairs. In your experience, can the traumatic impact of an emotional affair be just as severe as a physical one? And if so, why?
The attachment distress that happens, the attachment rupture, it's not distress, the rupture that happens when your safe person suddenly is elsewhere, internally, it's like an internal poison. It shatters your future, it shatters your identity, it shatters how you feel about the other person. You don't trust them, you don't trust your past, you don't trust you. It just undoes that person, and it makes no difference if it's an emotional affair, physical affair, pornography. It does the same thing. Betrayal is betrayal.
It's all about the keeping of secrets and deception. We wouldn't really compare and say one is worse than the other. However, we will just always acknowledge for anyone, your journey is going to be yours. We don't know what you brought, into this relationship. We don't know what happened in your past. That definitely could indicate, your timeline for healing. Also, the frequency will matter, but that doesn't necessarily equate to something I did with my body versus my heart.
I've heard a lot of people reference that the hardest thing to forgive was the deception.
And for a betrayed spouse, I think the pain and the language of I didn't trust you enough to tell you. I didn't trust that you could handle it. I didn't trust that you wouldn't judge me. I didn't trust you, and therefore I broke trust.
So what are some signs then that people might be in an emotional affair?
Ultimately, I have probably 5 things I look for, or at least a progression that people seem to follow. First is vulnerability, where you'll have someone you begin to talk to, and it's very comfortable, and you enjoyed that, and they are affirming you, so you continue to be vulnerable with them. And as you share, if they accept something you shared that was kind of difficult, then you keep sharing more in that vulnerability to get that acceptance. And so there's this incredible bond, and the other person's doing the same thing. So you've got this vulnerability. Next is kind of a boundary crossing. And the boundary crossing, in my mind, happens when you keep something secret. Let's say you go to lunch and you don't tell your mate. That's a boundary crossing, because your mate would have wanted to know, but you want to not let your mate know that happened. So now you've gone to stage 2 of an emotional affair. Stage 3 is the real killer, which is where someone finally says, hey, I really care about you. I have feelings for you, where you begin to admit that there are feelings. Once you cross that, to me, that's when you start the stopwatch. It is on. It is full-blown on. Next is acceptance and justification. This is where, in your own mind, you're really justifying it. You begin to tell yourself, this person is my person. This is my soul. I didn't marry my soulmate. I actually made a mistake with who I married. This person gets me, my mate doesn't get me. So in that kind of whole acceptance and justification, you're now telling yourselves why this is important. You're justifying it, not just, doing it. The 5th one is where the potential relationship consequences will come in, where your mate suddenly begins to say, whoa, you're spending way too much time. What's this? You've got 773 texts from this person? Yeah, but we're, quote, just friends. There's nothing really there. But you've already begun sharing your heart with this person, and you're not sharing your heart any longer with this person, because it feels like your mate's not giving you what you need. And I always like Shirley Glass's term, the makeup mirror versus vanity mirror. The emotional affair is always going to feel like they're affirming you. They're actually kind of a co-conspirator, and you feeling more like a victim, but they get you, while your mate is that makeup mirror that shows all your flaws.
With the list you just gave, is it constitute an emotional affair if it's just one-sided feelings and the person is unsure of the other ones?
It's usually a joint. Now, there's a thing called unrequited love, where somebody can have a terrible crush on somebody else and the other person's not reciprocating. To me, that's not an emotional affair. It's an issue that they need to get help with to figure out, how in the world do I disconnect? Why am I stuck on this person?
That's a great question. I think it still goes back to, if someone outside of a marriage has feelings for someone and it's not reciprocated, is it still a secret? It is something you're willing to share with your mate, or what are you not telling your mate? I do believe a lot of emotional affairs, they do begin in the mind, but with that lack of boundaries, we start to justify, and they really do start out what I would call quite innocently. We go to a lunch and we're just left there talking, but it's this just vulnerable conversation that, if we can really look back and be honest with ourselves, we really enjoyed.
And the boundary violation is really interesting. I think that when there's that flirting, when there's trying to find things in common with other people, when there's sharing vulnerably with someone who's a potential emotional affair partner, those are the boundary violations that ultimately start this thing off and get someone in trouble. It's never, oh, I'm trying to have an emotional affair. No, it's you're being dumb as a box of rocks, and you're opening up the door by the way you're acting towards someone.
For betrayed spouses, why is it so difficult for them to understand and cope with when this happens?
For many people that have been betrayed by their mate who's been entangled in an emotional affair, they just feel crazy. And so often, you don't want to feel that way, and you don't want to be perceived that you're controlling. I've seen really secure individuals that have some kind of gut impulse that something's wrong. But you pile that on top of an unfaithful spouse and an emotional affair that's just justifying. And so it can really add to them feeling insane, feeling out of control, and their gut's telling them, I think something might be off here. But then they'll put on the brakes, even unconsciously, of I don't want to, micromanage what my mate's doing at work. I don't want my mate to not have friends. But all the while, I think for the betrayed, it can really be insane.
Especially when their mate's telling them they're making a big deal out of nothing because we're just friends. But the attachment distress is exactly the same as if they were actually sleeping with the person, having sex with the person. It makes no difference to them. They just feel crazier because they're saying, well, we're friends, nothing's happened. Am I crazy jealous? Is something wrong? When in reality, their alarms bells that are going off, spot on.
Well, I would imagine too with the betrayed spouse, like they're thinking, okay, I'm noticing something's wrong, but do I want to shake up our life by like leaning into that? So there's almost this, it's much easier to be ignorant perhaps of what it is until it grows to a point that, okay, now I can't ignore this. Do you see that happen with people?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, and I would just say to anyone that is experiencing the betrayal of an emotional affair that absolutely some of the deepest and most painful betrayal wounds happen emotionally.
Absolutely.
Where there's never even a single
And the gaslighting is the strongest with emotional affairs as far as I'm concerned.
And the key word there, we're just friends. We just went out to lunch. We just had a conversation.
And why in the world won't you let me have friends? You were so controlling. You were this, you were that, because you've got some sort of hang up with me having friends that are of the opposite sex, which is like nuts.
I appreciate what Rick even started out with some of the stages of the emotional affair, meaning it just really starts out with this deception and lie of someone's own heart.
And the other thing is the intensity of the feelings in an emotional affair can be really strong, but there's a huge difference in the type of attachment you have extramaritally and the type of attachment you have inside a marriage. And your true attachment style does not show up until you're in that marital relationship. Out here, it's easy because you have a different type of desire. So we all can want what we don't have. That is a great motivator to get something you feel like you don't have. Inside a marriage, oftentimes you have who you don't want. So that's when you get to the point of having to figure out what am I like? What drives me? What's my attachment style? Ultimately, those feelings that are here, if they go to here, will go back to here. Those feelings change, but people don't think about that because they believe they found their soulmate.
I've heard Andy Stanley talk about this in terms of the right person myth. Have y'all heard this before?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it says, I must not have found the right person. That must mean the right person is actually outside of my marriage.
33% of people, the day they're walking down the aisles, there's 32%, excuse me, women in a Red Book study said they believed they were marrying the wrong person before they walked down the aisle, which, to me kind of supports that Disney myth that ultimately, if I marry the right person, I'll be happy. And if I'm not with the right person, I won't be happy, rather than figuring out if I am the right person, I'll be happy. Mm-hmm. But we look at it in an external locus of control where we think it's about our circumstances, not about our heart.
And oftentimes it's far easier to go look outside rather than looking at the marriage and going, okay, something's off here. We should talk about this, figure out what's going on.
An important piece, I think, in emotional affairs as well is the pain cuts really deeply. And you'll hear so often someone say, I'm not in love anymore, which we all know, the real commitment and the act of love we develop over time. But what happens, and I would even say in emotional affairs, it's not even love. We mentioned earlier, it is the way this person is making me feel.
It's a crush in a sense.
Oh, absolutely.
And how I can be vulnerable here, but I don't feel I can be vulnerable within the marriage. And so then they start saying things, the word intimacy, well, I'm not being intimate with this person. But, intimacy has a lot of definitions. It's not just sexual. Intimacy can be even more emotional, but they'll also justify because I'm not being intimate. That's another term I hear sometimes.
Intimacy is more a product of vulnerability, allowing yourself to be known, being known, knowing another, and that can happen regardless, without the physical component, even though that's a part of it eventually. To a betrayed spouse who has been hearing the word just a lot, and they're watching and listening right now, and their spouse is saying they're just, and maybe their spouse hasn't even admitted to it yet. What would y'all say to that?
Begin to trust whatever hunches they are having.
Exactly.
That something's off. The reality is, until the unfaithful spouse is ready to take ownership, to end this relationship, to move into a place of honesty, they can't do that for them.
Sometimes I'll have people, I'll give them words to say like, I'm not interested in an emotional menage a trois.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We are not doing a threesome in this relationship. They're not crazy. The person who's crazy in many ways, or at least not in touch with reality, is the person in the emotional affair. And so the betrayed spouse has to hold the ground and say, this isn't appropriate. Have them call affair recovery. I think that talking to even one of our intake workers, I think would give them
much needed validation
exactly.
of what they're going through. And in essence, the step becomes, and this is a long process, which I'm going to simplify today, the betrayed spouse is allowed agency to set the boundary when their mate doesn't have the boundaries in their relationships, and they can figure out how to do that, like Rick said.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in sharing
right.
you.
I think that's great too, because I think a lot of people watching, listening might assume like, oh, since it hasn't turned physical, that means I must not be qualified to reach out to affair recovery.
No.
And we know that's not at all the case.
This is the most common type of affair. Emotional affairs are an affair. They are a betrayal, and it is the most common form of betrayal.
So now what would y'all say to, let's say there's a wayward spouse watching because they've been caught in an emotional affair and they're confused, they're stuck, but they also don't understand why their betrayed spouse is so upset. And so they might say things like, it could have been worse, at least I didn't sleep with them, or maybe they're saying the just statements. What would you say to that person who's just caught in that maybe thinking pattern that's keeping them stuck?
Yeah, I would invite anyone listening that is in an emotional affair, trying to get out of one, or just on the other side of getting out of one. The process is lengthy. It requires a lot of grief, and it will require breaking that attachment. And in many ways, you'll hear phrases of, I miss my best friend. I feel like I've lost my best friend. This one person that I confided in for months and years is now gone. And then now I'm just left with my spouse who, can't stand the sight of me and is in so much pain. So it can be very, very painful, but in some ways for the unfaithful person that's been in an emotional affair, and we'll talk about that, kind of helping to point the way out, the way of ownership, of to say, what were the reasons that led you into this vulnerability in the first place? They get the opportunity to figure that out if they're willing to break off and really grieve that attachment.
One of the things I'm hearing y'all say is it's not willpower alone that's going to do that. It's some getting out of isolation, talking about it, getting help.
Getting in community. To me, that is where Hope for Healing is incredible, because what you need is daily contact in a healthy community to begin to backfill what you've lost when you stop an emotional affair.
Probably fair to say that it's complicated to say the things you just said to your betrayed spouse. But having a space where you can talk to other people doing the same thing or wrestling with the same stuff and saying, I feel like I'm losing my best friend or stuff like that, and not be judged for it, but be led towards a path of healing, that's why I think affair recovery exists, is to provide that space for people.
One other aspect to it to me is that, especially if they're thinking they can see themselves with this person in the future, what they've done is they create this vision of their future that includes this person. And the vision they now have with the person they're married to is like, purgatory. It feels like it's going to be horrible. So if you're caught with these two kind of visions of your future, it feels really crazy to think about being with this person when the future looks so bleak. And that's where a lot of work has to be done to go, first off, to see a realistic future with this person, and second, to rebuild a new future where you connect back to the legacy you've got and then build a viable future going forward that is really appealing. But it's more than just breaking it off. It's rebuilding your life.
And I'd like to just say one more thing to the unfaithful person in an emotional affair. So often these individuals already are caught up in this own morality struggle of, well, as long as I don't do this, I maybe won't be that bad. Well, it's going to take a lot of time to work through just really that shame of owning what they've done and going, okay, it wasn't that bad, but it is this, letting go of all of just kind of the mind warp that they become in, that I'm a good person. And so that's still kind of a shame-based narrative, if you will. But recognizing, you had this attachment. We're not going to judge it as bad, wrong, not punitive. More than let's figure out what led you to such deep deception, vulnerability, and secrets that, destroyed another person. Because most of the time, that's not who many of us want to be.
And I love what you just said, that somebody even saying I'm a good person is still a shame narrative, because it's a transactional perception of your identity, that your identity is based on what you do, good or bad. And yeah, that's a complicated place to be, because then you're always trying to chase a better version or a good version of you. And so what happens when something like this happens?
And so often, if we can point to the hope of restoration, which we get to see all the time around here, again, the word hope, to see after some time in recovery, someone who's been in an emotional affair, when they start to get honest, that in turn helps the betrayed spouse not feel crazy. It helps them heal. It helps them feel secure. And you see this person that's been betrayed actually become, they give them a chance to be the person that they've always needed. They give them a chance to meet them right there in all of those emotional needs that they were seeking in the first place outside of the marriage. That's what we get to see all the time around here. Now, that doesn't happen quickly. That can happen over years of work, but that's the best part about all of what we do and why we do what we do.
Yeah, for the one who strayed, the bottom line is, this is probably their best opportunity to be loved unconditionally. When they're able to own it and their mate still chooses to love them, not because of what they did, because they're good, but because in spite of what they've done, that is an amazing thing.
For couples navigating the aftermath of an emotional affair, what would you say to them? How can they move forward?
Betrayal, it is going to shatter your world. It's going to shatter your life circumstance for a while. It's going to alter your perception. It's going to alter a lot in your life, but it's not going to be life-ending. I mean, there is a way and a path forward to work through. And for those in the affair, it very much is going to feel like your life is over, that you have nothing to live for. You found out, clearly you've been trying to be good or bad. You don't want to be bad, and so you are a failure, and now your life is over. And that's certainly not the case. So the first, even most pragmatic step is to take the risk to reach out for help, to, talk to someone that knows what they're doing, which we have an entire intake staff of people that have not only been through it. I mean, again, affair recovery is built on the premise that people that guide and lead and work here have been through it. Reaching out for help would be step one, and getting people around you to get you to the next steps is vital.
For the person who was in the emotional affair, when you're with a group of people working through emotional affairs or physical, doesn't make any difference. When you're working through that, suddenly you see it differently. It's like you get out of this fantasy that you've been in when you listen to the other people. So you've got to get into a community. You've got to be with other people like you, your tribe, who goes, oh, we get it, where you're not feeling judged, but you're actually feeling like, okay, these are great guys, so there's nothing wrong with me. It's so important, I think, the people in your community, you begin to see you're not the pariah, even if you're feeling guilty. And you're also beginning to see clearly that this was crazy. What was I thinking? And so that community to me is also the next step. And that's where things like Hope for Healing or EMS Online helps.
Thank you guys both for talking through. I think it's a huge topic because people have so much confusion on it. And I think shedding some light on what it is and what y'all have seen in your experience is just helpful. And I hope and pray for anybody listening, they can just have the courage to take that first step, like you were saying.